everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started since we're at the top of the hour. Thanks so much for logging on early and thanks so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is introducing the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health new guide, Committed to Safety for All Survivors. And this webinar is in honor of Recovery Month, which is right now in the month of September, as well as Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which will begin tomorrow. Hence, we decided to host this on September 30th. And it's hosted by our center, the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. My name is Gabriela Zapata Alma, and I'm the Director of Policy and Practice on Domestic Violence and Substance Use with the center, and I'll be today's presenter. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using This Webinar System tab in the center of your screen. You can switch the screen from the slides by clicking the down arrow next to where it says Using This Webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. Third from the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat cloud icon at the bottom center of your screen to open your chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your colleagues, as well as to get in contact with the trainers or also Carla Alegria, also with the center. Carla is here to make sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible, and if you have any questions about troubleshooting the WebEx software, you may contact Carla Alegria using the chat function. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you'd like to respond to a question from myself or to contact center staff anytime during the session, or to share resources with colleagues. You can click on Carla Alegria to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's go ahead and test this chat feature now. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, and share with us where you're calling from, and then press enter. Welcome. Great to see where folks are joining us from. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. While folks can get a lot out of a chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can just feel distracting. So if this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you'd like to. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there's a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you don't want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word media viewer, the same way that you would if you want to close the chat. We've planned time at the end for question and answer. At the very end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief survey. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. I also want to note that sometimes the sound cuts in and out, and that this is likely due to internet connection. So feel free to call back in if that becomes a problem. When it's time, feel free to be entering questions as we go along. You should be able to see a Q&A box. And please be sure to enter any questions into that Q&A section so I can be sure to see it once we're at that point in the presentation. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties or you're unable to contact Carla, you may also call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issues. That phone number, which Carla will also post in the chat, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today. So now we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. Perfect. So This is me, Gabriella, and I am presenting today. I'm also the author of the guide that we are releasing today, and that this webinar is introducing. And everyone on the webinar, everyone who registers the webinar, will receive the guide in an email shortly after this webinar, and then it will also be posted on our website for anyone to be able to download and use. And so a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Policy and Practice on Domestic Violence and Substance Use. So I oversee and contribute to, along with my colleagues at the center, the training and technical assistance, policy analysis and development, as well as along with our research colleagues, contribute to research happening at the intersection of domestic violence and substance use. Before, I have spent over 15 years working with survivors in many different settings, from medical settings to housing, both transitional housing and permanent housing. And then I also designed and led formal treatment for many years as well, both substance use disorder as well as mental health treatment, where many of the people that we served in our treatment programs were survivors of both interpersonal violence as well as structural violence. And so it's through that lens that this guide was developed. And you'll see more information in the guide in terms of what were some of the kind of factors that shaped the guide. A little bit about our center. We're a special issue resource center dedicated to addressing the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. And so we have an array of training and technical assistance services and resources. We conduct research and evaluation, policy development and analysis, as well as public awareness. And here's our government funding information, as well as our government disclaimer that what I say and present in today's webinar does not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And at the center, this is our integrated framework. So everything we do is really rooted within this framework. And so really rooted within survivor-defined approaches, that survivors know what they need, what is helpful, what they define as their goals, and what may be problems, and what could be some potential resources in achieving stability, safety, and any goals that they define for themselves. That people are really the ones who are the expert on their own lives. That everything we do is based in physical and emotional safety. And understanding that safety, it's not just one universal or blanket definition of safety, but that there is, that we really need to connect and collaborate with folks to really understand how they understand safety, what helps them to feel safe, how do they connect with experiences of safety. So we're never here to kind of prescribe that. That everything we do needs to be really, really nestled within relationship and connection. So the importance of relationship as well as the challenges of relationship. And so understanding that everything we do is through these relational approaches, is through connecting with folks on a kind of radically deep level. And that all of this makes it possible to then also operate from a place where we are fostering hope and resilience. And so this creates the core of what then makes possible domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy and empowerment framework, a trauma-informed approach, an approach that is rooted in human rights and social justice, and has an awareness of and responsiveness to cultural, historical, and community context. So our topics for this session are introducing the newly released guide, and then also taking a little bit of a deeper dive into one of the first segments of the guide, which is applying an accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approach to substance use. Our toolkit on becoming accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organization provides a big foundation that this then adds to. And we also have links available to access that foundational resource that this really builds on and takes the conversation further in really responding to substance use. So here's the guide. Here's a picture of it, and then you'll all receive an email with the guide directly in your inbox. So here is the kind of basic organization of the guide. We have our introduction and then all these different segments. And this is the first webinar in a series that is launching that will really go into each of these segments so that you have both a guide to reference as well as a webinar series that can really help flesh out and provide examples of all of these different topics and areas, so that it's not just kind of like the guide alone, but that this goes along with the guide. So today we'll be, of course, introducing the guide and then also talking about that second piece that's in bold, the ACRTI approach to supporting people who use substances. But I'm also going to just do a brief introduction of each of these other segments so you know what to expect in each of these segments in the guide. So first, why? Why did we decide to create this guide and all of the resources that go along with this guide? So this really was born out of our understanding of the depth of the need, which was informed directly by survivors, advocates, program directors, and coalitions, as well as informed by research that's been conducted over the past 15 years. Research that we have conducted, as well as research that has been conducted in the field at large, that we have always made sure to stay abreast of and review and make sure that we're aware of kind of the latest evidence as well. So first off, knowing that there are many mental health and substance use effects that are associated with being abused by an intimate partner. And so people who experience domestic violence and sexual violence have a 6 times higher risk of developing a substance use disorder. And so a lot of the time we can feel like, substance use, that's not my area of specialty, that's not my expertise, someone else has to deal with that. But when we start understanding how kind of inextricably interwoven experiences of victimization and then substance use are, we start realizing that this is a big part of the picture. And so while this guide is not about making anybody a substance use counselor, that's a whole different guide and a whole different webinar series. At the same time, we do need to know how to support survivors who are experiencing substance use and potentially experiencing substance use disorders, because this is part of the picture. This is one of the many potential effects of intimate partner violence, of domestic violence. We also know that DV is often targeted towards undermining a partner's substance use, undermining their substance use health, treatment, and recovery. And so this data comes from a survey-style research that we conducted in partnership with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And the results were just really eye-opening. So these were survivors who were calling the hotline and weren't in crisis at the time of their call and agreed to participate in answering a handful of questions as part of this study. So nobody was pre-screened for, using substances or having a substance use history. This is just general callers. And from general callers, thousands of general callers, it was found that 26% had used substances at some point to reduce the pain of domestic violence. That 27% had been pressured or forced to use substances or made to use more than they wanted by a partner or ex-partner. 24% of callers, so 24%, a quarter of callers, were afraid to call the police because their partner said they would be arrested or not believed due to substance use. And then 38%, so nearly 40%, said their partner had threatened to report their substance use to authorities to prevent them from getting something they wanted or needed. And a lot of times this was a protection order or custody of their children or being able to work or being able to get, really isolating survivors from family and friends and other sources of safety and support. And of those who had tried to get any kind of help around substance use, whether it was treatment or going to like a self-help group, anything, any kind of support, 60% said that their partner or ex-partner had tried to prevent or discourage them from getting help. So we can see that, without this kind of skill set and this lens, then this is just something, a way that abuse will continue to manifest and will continue to really target survivors, both in initiating substance use as well as escalating from that initial use to more problems related with substance use. So it really is part of our advocacy. It's not something that's kind of like added on or outside of our wheelhouse. So again, I'm so glad that you all are here today, and I'm so glad to be able to share this resource with y'all. So some more information around framing the need for this guide. So very recently, we surveyed domestic violence programs across states, territories, and tribal nations. Of the 527 programs that responded, 75% indicated an increased demand for substance use disorder treatment services between 2017 to 2019. And only 1 in 5 felt very prepared to meet the needs of survivors who experience substance use concerns. So we hear you loud and clear. The need is there, and we hope to really be able to answer this need through this guide as well as through a whole suite of new kind of training and technical assistance services and resources that we are launching as part of this guide. So while this guide makes reference to substance use treatment, the real goal of this guide is to support advocates to move beyond conversations about treatment. So in the same way that DV advocacy is grounded in the ability to support survivors, whether or not they've decided or are able to leave an abusive relationship, this guide is a resource for advocates to be able to support survivors whether or not they've decided or are able to stop using substances. So it's really about going beyond that treatment conversation, because too often that's kind of like the response that a survivor will get. And if that's not where they're at, or if that doesn't feel possible, then the conversation and the support and the options just kind of fall flat, right? They just kind of stop right there. So while safety planning in this context, we're experts in safety planning, right? We're experts in partnering with survivors to support their physical, emotional, and financial safety while also suspending our judgment and knowing how to manage our fear around someone's safety. Understanding that we're human and we have emotional responses and we have personal and professional experiences that come up with us. That just means we're alive, right? And so it's not about eliminating that. It's about being aware of that and knowing how to work with that, how to manage that, so that that's not what's guiding our services, right? That's not what's kind of at the center of our advocacy. And so in this context, we understand safety planning as supporting survivors and recognizing potential risks and then strategizing, collaborating and strategizing to mitigate those risks. And that also at the same time, coming from a place of empathy, understanding all of the complex situations and decisions survivors face. We know that an all or nothing approach aren't helpful when it comes to supporting people experiencing domestic and sexual violence. So what would it look like if we approach substance use as any other relationship that may have some risk? Interestingly, many times people talk about their substance use and experience their substance use as if it were a relationship. And, I can think back to when I was working in a convenience store many moons ago. And at that time, I was still smoking cigarettes. And when I would take my breaks and I'd go outside and have a cigarette, I remember I never felt alone. I remember that I felt like that cigarette was almost like keeping me company. And it may sound like an odd thing if that's not an experience you've ever had, but I hear that experience from so many survivors who have substance use histories where really in a lot of ways the substance is just another relationship and has a lot of the same dynamics as relationships. And so in that way, we're actually really well positioned and prepared to help people become aware of what are some of those potential risks to safety, and then how do we counteract those? How do we manage those? How do we support safety and well-being amidst potential risky and abusive relationships, right? So most, if not all, DV programs and advocates want to support survivors who use substances. So what happens? Many times we feel like we don't have the knowledge or resources to be able to. And yet the skills needed to support survivors who use substances can feel really far away from our daily advocacy work. One of the things that led me to specializing in substance use was because I just really felt like I had no idea what to do every time that I was working with someone and there was substance use. I felt totally at a loss of how I could help, what support I could offer that would be relevant, that would be helpful. And a lot of times I felt even nervous or sometimes even scared about what I could do that could actually be helpful for someone and not potentially be another source of harm in their life. And so I truly understand what it's like to be in a place where it's like, I don't understand anything about this. And I feel like I really am unprepared to be able to help someone who's experiencing this. And so I just want to, again, express gratitude for all of you and being here today and leaning in to what are many times very complex situations and really showing up for survivors. So all the skills that we use as advocates every day to support survivors who are seeking safety and freedom from abuse parallel the skills that can help survivors increase their self-determination and safety related to substances. So I tell you now on the other kind of side of having become trained and really worked in the field of substance use and having worked with survivors using substances for over a decade. Now that I'm on kind of the other side of that, I will tell you there's no magic wand. There are no easy kind of cookie cutter solutions. There's no magic wand. But I can also say that the skills that you're using every day, we can actually just in many ways apply to the relationship with substances. And so in this way, domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy programs and advocates are uniquely prepared and positioned to support survivors who use substances. Because believe me, when folks show up to treatment, even treatment programs that may specialize in the needs of survivors, that expertise around safety planning, around understanding the complex realities of survivors is not always there. And so really points to the need for collaboration as well as points to the need for us to never turn someone away because of things related to substance use. So, how can we best support survivors? So it's really through our everyday advocacy skills that supporting survivors as an advocate, not trying to become a substance use counselor, although it can be great if our program does have the ability to either collaborate with a substance use disorder treatment or recovery support provider or harm reduction program or all of the above. Or if you do have people on staff who are cross-trained, those are great resources. But that's not kind of the point of this guide, and that's not the focus of this guide. And so this guide isn't about becoming a substance use counselor, even though we absolutely support programs that are able to collaborate and integrate that kind of skill set. So this is all about applying our advocacy skill set to substance use. So if it's that simple, Gabriella, what gets in the way? Why do we have a guide about this? So the key to unlocking, applying the skills we already have, is to overcome the stigma our society places on substance use. So we can best support survivors who use substances by approaching their substance use in the same ways that other safety needs are approached, through empowerment-based voluntary services that offer assistance with survivors' self-defined goals, increases their access to desired resources, and supports safety planning. So some things to know about the connection between stigma, domestic and sexual violence, and substance use. So experiencing a mental health or substance use condition increases people's risk for being controlled by an abusive partner. And why is this form of abuse so pervasive? Why is substance use coercion so pervasive? Why are people who use substances experience so much increased targeting of domestic violence and sexual violence? And a big part of the reason is because of stigma. That I can tell you in talking with survivors how often I've heard time and time again that an abusive partner or ex-partner would say to them, pretty much like, good luck getting help. No one's going to help you because you use substances. But of course, they would say it in much more abusive ways. And then when they would try to go and get some kind of help, they would get turned away. And so it was kind of proving the abusive partner right. And we can just imagine all of the hopelessness and all of the kind of ongoing danger that people experience, as well as their family members and their children. So truly, stigma associated with substance use and mental health conditions contributes to the effectiveness of these abusive tactics, as well as creating barriers for when survivors do try to get some help. And we know that, people will leverage that people who are seeking to exert power and control over their partners will leverage whatever they can in the abuse of their partners. And so stigma makes substance use super easy to leverage as just another site of harm, another site of abuse. And so this is further complicated in the context of structural violence. So in addition to really contributing to the increased risk and being targeted by domestic violence and sexual violence, stigma has also been found to increase health risk, internalized shame, which then is a huge driver for riskier and more chaotic substance use, and has even been linked to increasing overdose risk. So stigma isn't just oh, I feel bad. It's really, really dangerous. And understanding that survivors who use substances experience overlapping and intersecting forms of stigma, that they're experiencing, very likely is experiencing the stigma related to just surviving domestic or sexual violence, the stigma of substance use, potentially stigma related to mental health. On top of that, there's added stigma for women who use substances and anyone who is a parent who uses substances. And potentially, if someone is pregnant, that is also just a much more intense stigma that person is experiencing. So we can see how it's not, stigma is so incredibly dangerous and such a barrier to safety and stability. And then on top of that, so many survivors face intersecting forms of stigma that show up, that can show up in ourselves, in our services, in our programs, right? So, and there's a lot of ways that this shows up. I remember once talking with a program director who shared, well, how can we, if we are supporting survivors who are using substances, aren't we kind of delivering the message that we approve of their substance use? That's a really important question to discuss and grapple with and get some input and feedback around if that's a question that is informing policies or advocacy at all. And the kind of like stigma clarification piece here is that people, don't need my permission or anyone else's permission to use substances. They don't need my approval or anyone else's approval to use substances. The reasons why people use substances are much more complex than that. And it also it glosses over how much shame people often experience, as well as experiences of emotional abuse related to their substance use from partners and ex-partners. So really much more taking the approach that people probably already expect us not to approve, probably already expect shame and judgment around their substance use, because frankly, that's likely what they have gotten in every other area of their life. And so we really don't have to even worry about delivering a message that we are approving of substance use. Actually, quite the opposite. We have to work to kind of counteract the expectation of judgment and shame. So an accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approach both requires us as well as supports, requires as well as supports the expansion of skills and services to support survivors who use substances, while also actively fighting the stigma that's so often used against them. And so here, really taking a moment to reflect on all of the intersecting sources of harm and the complexity of control tactics that survivors and their children face. And while we certainly don't have control over an abusive partner's control tactics and abuse tactics, people who, use power and control and violence over their partners are accountable to their own behavior. What we do have control over is eradicating stigma within our own services, our own advocacy and responses, as well as advocating with those systems that survivors and their children end up needing to access or somehow intersecting with, so that we are actively advocating with all those different systems that may become involved in the lives of survivors and their children. So as part of the introduction of the guide, there's a set of reflection questions for people to be able to really both reflect individually as well as discuss within teams and programs and with trusted peers to really reflect on our own attitudes around substances, people who use substances, substance use and recovery, to be able to reflect on how these show up in our advocacy, in our programs, in our policies. And that this, in many ways, is really foundational to being able to respond to the needs of survivors who use substances. And this is, of course, part of reflective practice. So reflective practice is an important tool to be able to eradicate the stigma in ourselves and in our services. So here, really thinking about what personal and professional experiences have influenced my views on substance use and people who use substances, and how do these show up in my advocacy? And why might survivors who use substances hesitate to access our program, right? There's a lot of folks who, even by the time that they access our program, that's taken a lot of courage, because what they expect many times, or what they've been told will happen, is that they'll be judged and turned away, right? Even as part of the kind of pattern of isolation by the abusive partner or ex-partner. So why might survivors who use substances hesitate to access our program? And what can we do to enhance access? And then also asking ourselves some hard questions around what happens to survivors and their children if they are not allowed to enter or are exited from our services. And how does that impact the risks that they face? And then really reflecting on how does this align with our mission and our values, right? Really being aware when we are engaging kind of like a bypass around our values. So sometimes I've heard, a bypass show up as, well, we can't help everyone. Okay, well, sure. There's no one program and that can help every single person on the face of the earth. That's true. But how are we using that as a way to kind of avoid the tough questions about what needs to maybe be addressed in our own programs, in our own advocacy, right? How are we using that as a way to bypass the misalignment between what's happening and our mission and values, right? And then looking at how does stigma and discrimination against people who use substances show up in our services. And this can take a lot. It's not just like a one-time thing, right? Because it's very easy to think, oh, well, we've done it. We've eradicated that stigma. And yet stigma always has a way of kind of creeping in, especially when we feel like we're under pressure in times of crisis, right? And so really always kind of continuously being able to reflect on this and dig deeper and deeper, right? Like, for example, if we are making assumptions that someone is an unsafe parent just because they use substances, that's a way that stigma is showing up, because there's actually, many people the majority of people who use a substance don't actually have a substance use disorder. And there are many people who are living with a substance use disorder that are still able to effectively parent. That doesn't mean that people don't ever need parenting support. That doesn't mean that, we just completely ignore that children need some safety planning and resources. But being aware of how stigma is showing up in those assumptions that come up. And then from all of that, looking at that solution-focused question of how can we enhance safety and equity for all survivors? So I'm going to skip the section on accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approaches to substance use, because after I go through each of the sections of the guide, I'm going to actually come back to that to take a deeper dive into that section. So the following section talks about why might survivors use. And so this is really looking at understanding the intersecting factors that contribute to ongoing substance use. So this guide is really about how to support folks who continue to use substances. It's not about how to work with folks who may have used substances a long time ago. It's about kind of that ongoing substance use or current substance use. This section also clarifies those connections between substance use and domestic and sexual violence, as well as offers some kind of conversation starters around how to open up some conversations around substance use within our advocacy programs and services. The next section talks about policies and practices that promote safety within program settings. And so here, it's really about concrete guidance around what policies and practices within an ACRTI approach will promote safety. A lot of times, we will equate substance use with danger. That's a very common kind of leap or assumption or connection to make. And part of the reason I think why it's really easy to kind of make that jump is because many of us who are conducting danger assessments, which is a great practice, a really important practice, know that when an abusive partner or ex-partner has substance use as part of their experience, that increases danger for survivors. And so I want to also remind us that we also are clear in that substance use doesn't cause the abuse. It doesn't cause the violence. It exacerbates the abuse or violence. It increases the lethality of the abuse or violence, but it doesn't cause it, right? And so here, so because of the kind of association that often gets made between substance use and danger, many people have really important questions around how do I show up for survivors who use substances while also supporting overall safety, while supporting safety for both survivors who use substances as well as survivors who do not use substances, children who are present, as well as staff members, advocates. And so this section takes a deep dive into each of those pieces and unpacking it, and we'll also have additional kind of resources rolling out in the near future to really help flesh out this piece, including some peer-based learning pieces. Because we've also heard loud and clear from coalitions and from programs how important peer-based learning is. And we know that it's learning is so much more deepened when we can hear from folks who are actively in the field and are implementing these changes. From there, moving into understanding the dimensions of substance use. So this piece provides a framework for being able to understand many of the dynamics that are parts of substance use experiences. So if you're kind of coming on this journey with me of going beyond just, someone's using substances, they have to go to treatment, right? We're going beyond that. So then what do we need in order to go beyond that? We need some tools to be able to understand someone's relationship with substances and their substance use experience. So this framework supports cultivating that deeper empathy and active listening. It also is an entryway into really being able to collaborate with folks around those survivor-defined solutions and individualized approaches. So at no point are we just engaging kind of like a cookie-cutter response. And then the next section focuses on meeting people where they are. This presents a framework for providing survivor-defined support that includes strategies for being able to really notice where people are in their relation to substance use. And then from there, based on where they're at in their relationship to substances and substance use, provides guidance on what would have the best chance of feeling like relevant support at that time. What would feel most helpful? Because a lot of times, it's a lot of times what ends up happening is that the resources or the kind of strategies that we're offering might just not be meeting people where they are. It might end up feeling really alienating for folks because, if I'm talking to someone about treatment and they don't feel like their substance use is a problem, then I'm kind of shutting down the conversation, right? I'm missing the survivor-defined piece, and I'm missing being able to kind of collaborate and coming up with relevant resources and options. And so this segment provides an evidence-based framework for being able to both kind of figure out where people are and then be able to meet them there. So really kind of unpacking that piece. The next section is focused on resource advocacy. So it looks at the internal and external resources that promote healing and recovery for people who use substances, and invites programs to really reflect on which resources are already available in the services that they offer, as well as what resources could be added or expanded. And often, a lot of these different services and activities can be added or expanded with little to no cost. And then the following section is a deeper dive into what really unpacking what it looks like to safety plan around substance use and domestic violence, kind of a co-integrated safety planning. So it presents this in-depth method for substance use safety planning while focusing on a survivor's self-defined goals, and at the same time, really supporting health, responsible and informed decision-making, and overall well-being. And then our overdose prevention section prepares programs to respond to overdose within their own settings, as well as prepares programs to offer overdose prevention education. The tragic reality is that we are still amidst an overdose epidemic. Every 3 out of 5 lives lost to overdose was preventable. And so, if any loss of life is tragic, but there's something about this being so preventable with the right information and resources. Really, any one of us can help save a life. And so this segment prepares programs and advocates to offer this life-saving education and safety planning around overdose. And there's also a recorded webinar from August 19th, 2019 that offers this information as well. So you don't have to kind of wait for another webinar to come out about this. There's one in our webinar library that you can go ahead and watch whenever you would like to. And then the appendix, which has more information on our integrated approach, a glossary of terms, since I surely remember, not having been trained in substance use and really just trying to get a sense of what these kind of different language and definitions are. There's a piece that addresses common myths and misconceptions. Because of the rampant stigma, there is just so many myths surrounding substance use. There's a piece that has really explicit directions around using naloxone, which is the antidote for reversing an overdose due to opioids. There's a piece talking about safer bathroom guidelines, and then as well as a resource directory on mutual aid resources, sometimes also known as self-help resources. And then the last part of the appendix is information on commonly used substances, because we've heard loud and clear from folks that a lot of times it's just like, I just don't even know kind of what the different commonly used drugs are, and how can I get some information on that? And so while that isn't the focus of this guide, we wanted to make sure to point you in the right direction for science-based information on commonly used substances. So now that we've made it through kind of the walkthrough of the guide and the different sections of the guide, thanks for hanging with me through that. Now we're going to really focus on supporting people within that accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed approach. And so it builds on this guide, which I mentioned at the beginning, on tools for transformation, becoming accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations, which you can find on our website. And there's many available kind of additional tools around this topic in addition to this foundational guide. So let me go back a moment, actually. So in case you aren't already familiar with the ACRTI Foundation, I do want to provide just a moment of background on it. So this was initially developed as a way to bridge trauma-informed and advocacy perspectives. It's an approach that's grounded in domestic and sexual violence advocacy. It incorporates an understanding of trauma and its effects, creates accessible environments for healing, recognizes the centrality of culture, attends to the well-being of staff, organizations, and communities, and is committed to social justice and human rights. The core principles of ACRTI work, the physical and emotional safety, hope and resilience, relationship and connection, and a survivor-defined approach, provide the foundation for creating services that are welcoming and inclusive. And these are attuned to the range of people's experiences and relevant to the people and communities we serve. So this approach is really fundamental to creating the relational environment of emotional and physical safety that's necessary for supporting survivors, including survivors who use substances. So we offer, as I mentioned, this guide as well as a whole lot of other TTA services and resources around really cultivating this approach. So from the lens of applying accessibility to substance use. So accessible services for people who use substances are necessary from both a perspective of safety as well as a perspective of human rights. That people don't lose their right to safety and self-determination just because they use substances. So within this framework, substance use is approached in a matter-of-fact manner. It's not good or bad, it just is what it is. And so with full knowledge that safety planning in the context of substance use requires us to be able to go beyond condemning or ignoring someone's substance use. So in practice, people are screened into services based on need rather than screened out because of substance use. So substance use, like so many other experiences, has so many different facets, and it's greatly influenced by both internal and external factors. So creating greater accessibility for people with different kinds of substance use needs and experiences involves being able to better understand each person's experience from their own perspective and appreciating that people have important reasons for using substances. So, someone's substance use might seem like it is in direct opposition to the goals that they've shared with us. So when this is the case, it's that much more important for us to really have that empathic approach, to really seek to understand people from their own experience, to understand what is it that they're getting out of their substance use, and what would they find helpful in supporting their safety and well-being. And so from this vantage point, it's really that perspective of only right doors. No wrong doors, only right doors. From the kind of angle of cultural responsiveness, a culturally responsive approach recognizes the importance of social identity. And social identity, I mean like things like age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, faith, sexual orientation, etc. And that within understanding social identity, also understanding positionality. So the access to our experiences of marginalization, of societal oppression, as well as our areas of privilege. And that social identity and our positionality shapes our relationship with substance use and recovery. So part of this is understanding that the pathways of recovery are also deeply influenced by culture and positionality. So much so that many people do not even identify with the word recovery, and instead might connect with concepts such as healing, well-being, getting healthy, finding peace, or connecting with community, with family, or with spirit, both an individual sense of spirit as well as a more universal spirit. A culturally responsive approach also recognizes that paradigms surrounding substance use and recovery have been historically based on male-centric and Eurocentric narratives. And so here, for example, whereas traditional substance use treatment approaches have positioned concepts like enabling or codependency as kind of foundational to the understanding of substance use, a culturally responsive approach recognizes that everyone benefits from safe relationships and support. This framework also brings an awareness of how, quote, codependency is a pathologizing term that's often been applied to individuals, particularly women, who've been financially isolated and oppressed, as well as how many times, those who nurture others because of their natural strengths and qualities, or because that's the role that society has demanded of them. So a culturally responsive practice reclaims nurturing as a strength, not as a liability, and recognizes the interdependence of people while also being aware of how power dynamics lead to isolating and exploitative relationships that, of course, are never the fault of survivors. And so here we see how the centering of mostly male and Eurocentric narratives within substance use treatment services and recovery services has then had this effect where program models around substance use treatment many times conflict with advocacy approaches. And this leaves a lot of survivors who use substances caught between fragmented services with no real access to resources or support that are responsive to their needs. So this becomes especially compounded for folks who experience marginalization, including people of color and people impacted by poverty. And people of color and people impacted by poverty are much more likely to be subject to criminalization and harsher penalties associated with substance use, while also experiencing discrimination and reduced access to resources that aid in recovery. And so here, again, really being able to take in and be aware of and responsive to how individual experiences of substance use disorder and recovery and resources that aid in recovery are many times informed and shaped by social identity and positionality. And so culturally responsive approaches for survivors who use substances endeavor to offer culturally resonant and humble services while also having an awareness of how interpersonal violence is inextricably tied to structural violence. So the trauma-informed piece here and applied to substance use. So trauma-informed approaches are going to recognize the relationship between substance use, trauma, domestic violence, and sexual violence. And then it's going to integrate this knowledge into the policies and practices. And a lot of times it's easy to get stuck here, right? A lot of times when I'm working with programs and with folks, it's like we get how it's connected, but then when we're going to go do something differently in our policies to reflect this knowledge, that's where it gets harder, it gets stuck, right? And so here, again, this guide speaks to that piece as well as many of our TTA services. So here we also, we don't want to lose our advocacy approach as soon as substance use comes into the picture or as soon as someone shares with us, part of their experience related to substance use. So from a trauma-informed lens, we understand how attempts to control someone's decisions, including their decision to use substances, need to be avoided for many reasons. That attempts to control or pressure someone replicates the power dynamics that they experience in abusive relationships. And that just how a survivor is an expert on their relationship and that pressure to leave a relationship could actually increase their danger, a trauma-informed approach to substance use understands that a survivor is the expert on their life and that the pressure to stop using substances is more likely to increase their risk. And this shows up in so many different ways. From very basic, for example, if someone is using opioids, we pressure them to stop and their tolerance drops. And then they go back to using opioids because they don't have the right resources and supports in place to be able to address their cravings and withdrawal. They're at much higher risk for overdose at that point because their tolerance has dropped. So in very, very basic ways, it can increase danger to try to pressure someone to stop using substances. It can also increase their danger because if they're experiencing substance use coercion, then it's very likely that the abuse might get worse if they stop their substance use altogether. So this is where those top-down approaches, really aren't really going to work in supporting survivors' safety and stability. So within a trauma-informed approach, really centering the importance of empathic connection. So instead of trying to control folks or tell folks what they need to do with their substance use or turning folks away due to substance use, each person is embraced with support for their self-determination and unwavering respect for their dignity. So this is all based on a foundation of active listening to what survivors share, while also deeply listening for what someone may feel but has not yet put into words. This is especially important in supporting survivors who use substances who are often blamed and shamed for the violence and substance use they have experienced. Literally talking with survivors, I have heard so many times survivors share that they had someone that a therapist or someone else who was providing services say to them that it was that they wouldn't have experienced that domestic or sexual violence if they would have just been sober. And we know that's not the case. We know that survivors are never to blame for the abuse and the violence that they are that is used against them, right? And so this is part of that trauma-informed piece of understanding that survivors get this blaming and shaming from so many areas of their life, and that we're here to radically counteract that. And that in order to be able to radically counteract that, we also have to be able to embrace complexity, that we have to be able to hold multiple truths and appreciate multiple perspectives, and that we can understand the link between substance use, trauma, domestic and sexual violence, while also being open to the complex realities of how substance use can be used by abusive partners as a tool of abuse. And at the very same time, a survivor may also be using a substance to cope with the abuse. So that kind of these things that feel very opposite are often true at the very same time. And that our ability to hold these complexities is really supported when there's an organizational culture and structure that supports reflection and awareness. So self-reflection and self-awareness. And here is our model from Kathy Cave, our senior TA provider, and we're so blessed to have her as part of our center and her colleague. This model comes from Kathy and her colleague. And so this is the model here for that reflective practice. And that this is really a foundation to being able to do ACRTI. So that trauma-informed approaches that include this awareness of what we as individuals bring to our interactions with survivors, as well as how we've been personally impacted when we are truly open to the experiences of other people. So here, in the context of supporting survivors who use substances, this includes being aware of what informs our own values and norms and perspectives surrounding substance use. Really be able to question, where did those come from? What led to their development? This often includes our own personal experiences and choices related to substance use. It can also include family, community, and how culture informs our perspectives on substance use, as well as any personal experiences of trauma or crisis that involve substances. And that this self-awareness is a necessary ingredient for this reflective practice, which is often supported in reflective supervision, including reflective supervision with peers. The staff are able to create a healing environment for survivors when organizations are able to create a healing environment for staff. And for more information, definitely check out our organizational toolkit, as well as the implementation tool guide that was just released, I want to say last week, and was authored by Kathy, and that I also contributed to. So for ACRTI and substance use, kind of, in summary, the key elements includes honoring survivor-defined needs and solutions, really recognizing how substance use, trauma, domestic violence, and sexual violence are all intertwined. They're a big old ball of wax. Taking a matter-of-fact approach to substances. Substances aren't good or bad, they just are what they are. Helping people to safety plan and mitigate those potential harms, meeting people where they are, and the no wrong door approach. And that these are really aligned with our values and intentions, that when we go into this work, we want to honor each person's wholeness We want to, provide culturally responsive support, preserve dignity and choice. We want to use person-first language and not be judging or labeling anybody. We want to actively prevent revictimization and re-traumatization, and that we want to be present, non-judgmental, and be really connected and caring. And so with all of our values and intentions, what gets in the way when it comes to substances? A lot of times it's worrying about what if. And a lot of times it's feeling like I already feel so out of control with the substance use that if I all relax on the kind of control around substance use, then it's just going to get even more out of control, right? That kind of shows up a lot of times in the what if piece. Also, just gaps in information. And I can so relate to that. I remember as soon as like substance use would come up, so many times the kind of thought that would come up inside me would be like, oh, we have to get you to a substance use specialist. Like they have to, work with this. They have to help you before I know what to do, right? Our own experiences, stigma, labeling, just not knowing what could be helpful, not wanting to cause harm. And also what can get in the way is not being aware of crisis plans and policies or not being able to act on them. And this is especially true if we have a real strong association between substance use and danger or substance use and crisis. And so something that I like to really always invite folks in is understanding that regardless of whether substance use is involved or not, we still need to know how to effectively help prevent and respond to crisis, right? And that we actively need to be able to support folks in crisis response and recovery. So, being aware of crisis plans and policies and having sufficient infrastructure and support to be able to meaningfully enact these, this isn't just about substance use. This is about our overall programming. And then with that, being able to really take the perspective that very often we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. And so much of this work will involve just our own personal exploration, development, and growth. And so with that, I'd like to introduce what the next pieces in this series will be, and they'll be offered every other month. So it'll be offered on the months that are an odd number. So for November, we'll be looking at understanding the dimensions of substance use and why survivors may continue to use substances. In January, we'll be looking at organizational policies and practices that promote safety within programs. In March, we'll be talking about meeting people where they are and resources that support safety, healing, and empowerment. And then in May, we will be taking that really deep dive into supporting survivor safety and choice within substance use, which is essentially applying safety planning skills to experiences of substance use, including the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and substance use coercion. We want you to stay tuned because coming soon, we are going to be launching an online resource hub that's dedicated to supporting survivors who use substances within shelter and other residential settings. We've really heard from survivors, advocates, and coalitions that so much of, while all of this information applies to really all areas of advocacy work, that there are some unique experiences and situations that come up in shelter and in transitional housing and other residential settings. So we want to speak directly to those unique circumstances and needs. And as I mentioned earlier, I spent over a decade in residential services. So I'm no stranger to what it means to work where someone else lives. And so in this resource hub, we will feature interviews with survivors, shelter directors, coalitions, and advocates. We'll feature program spotlights. So if you are a program that has started doing any of this work, has made changes to increase access and responsiveness to survivors who use substances, please reach out to me. I'd love to interview you. I'd love to feature your program. This online resource hub will also have tip sheets as well as a resource directory. So with that, I want to just point out some additional resources we have on our website. This is just a selection, my contact information, as well as more ways to connect. Always feel free to reach out to me. I want to say thank you for joining us today. And then I want to open up the floor for question and answer. So if you have a question and you haven't yet put it in the Q&A box, now is your chance. All right, I'll wait a few more moments to see if anybody is trying to type a question. All right. Well, I will go back to the slide with my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you do have any questions or ideas or you want to offer input. And with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Carla for making this webinar run smoothly. You'll be receiving the guide in your inbox, and then within the next week, we'll also send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides. And all of this will also be available on our website. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful or what could have been better, as well as what topics in substance use you would like to see us cover. Thanks again, and we hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.